Flight into Danger by Arthur Hailey and John Castle. Steady rain slanting through the harsh glare of its headlights, the taxicab swung into the approach to Winnipeg Airport, screeched protestingly round the asphalt curve, and braking hard, came to a spring-shuddering stop outside the bright neons of the reception building. Its one passenger almost leaped out. He tossed a couple of bills to the driver, seized an overnight bag, and hurried to the swing doors. Inside, the warmth and lights of the big hall halted him for a moment. With one hand, he turned down the collar of his damp topcoat, glanced at the wall clock above him, then half strode, half ran to where the departure desk of Cross Canada Airlines stood bar-like in a corner, deserted now, except for the passenger agent checking through a manifest. As the man reached him, the agent picked up a small stand microphone on his desk, summoned the man to silence with a lift of his eyebrows, and with measured precision began to speak. Flight 98, direct fleetliner service to Vancouver with connections for Victoria, Seattle, and Honolulu, leaving immediately through Gate 4. All passengers for Flight 98 to Gate 4, please. No smoking till you're in the air. A group of people rose from the lounge seats or detached themselves from a bored perusal of the newsstand and made their way thankfully across the hall. The man in the topcoat opened his mouth to speak, but was practically elbowed aside by an elderly woman stuttering in her anxiety. "Young man," she demanded, "is Flight 63 from Montreal in yet?" "No, madam," said the passenger agent smoothly. "It's running," he consulted his list, "approximately 37 minutes late." "Oh, dear, and I've arranged for my niece to be in—" "Look," said the man in the topcoat urgently, have you got a seat on Flight 98 for Vancouver?" The passenger agent shook his head. "Sorry, sir, not one. Have you checked with reservations?" "I didn't have time. I came straight to the airport on the chance of a cancellation." The man slapped the desk in frustration. "You sometimes have one, I know." "Quite right, sir. But with a big game in Vancouver tomorrow, things are chock full. All of our flights are completely booked, and I doubt if you'll be able to get out of here before tomorrow afternoon." The man swore softly, dropped his bag to the floor, and tipped his dripping felt hat to the back of his head. "Of all the lousy deals. And I've got to be in Vancouver by tomorrow noon at the latest." "Don't be so rude," snapped the old lady testily. "I was talking now. Young man, listen carefully. My niece is bringing with her—" "Just a moment, madame," cut in the passenger agent. He leaned across the desk and tapped the sleeve of the man with his pencil. "Look, I'm not supposed to tell you this." "Yes, what?" "Well, really," exploded the old lady. "There's a charter flight in from Toronto. They're going out to the coast for this game. I believe there were a few seats light when they came in. Perhaps you could grab one of those." "Well, that's great," exclaimed the man in the topcoat, picking up his bag again. "Do you think there's a chance?" "No harm in trying." Well, where do I ask, then? Who's the guy to see?" The agent grinned and waved across the hall. "Right over there, the Maple Leaf Air Charter." "Well, thanks a lot," said the man. He walked briskly over to a smaller desk displaying the fascia board of the Air Charter Company. "I wonder, can you help me? Have you by any chance a seat left on a flight to Vancouver?" "Vancouver, I'll see." The pencil checked rapidly down a passenger list, then, just one. "Flight's leaving straight away, though. It's overdue as it is." "Well, that's fine. Now, can I have that seat, please?" The agent reached for a ticket stub. "Name, sir?" "George Spencer." It was entered quickly with the flight details. "That's $65 for the one-way trip, sir." "Thank you. Glad to be of service. Any bags, sir?" "Only one. I'll keep it with me." In a moment, the bag was weighed and labeled. "Here you are, then, sir. Tickets, your boarding pass. Go to Gate 3 and ask for Flight 714. Please hurry, sir. The plane's about to leave." Spencer nodded and hurried to the departure gate. Already, men were preparing to disengage the passenger ramp. Bounding across the intervening puddles, Spencer reached them, handed over the detachable half of his ticket, and ran lightly up the steps, a gust of errant wind plucking at his hat. He was joined shortly by a stewardess, a mackintosh draped around her, who smiled. "Good evening, sir. Pleased to have you aboard." "I was lucky to make it." "There's a seat forward," said the girl. Spencer slipped out of his coat, took off his hat, and walked along the aisle till he came to the vacant seat. "Good evening," came the stewardess's sprightly voice over the public address system. "The Maple Leaf Air Charter Company welcomes aboard its new passengers to Flight 714. We hope you will enjoy our flight. Please fasten your safety belts. We shall be taking off in a few moments." As Spencer fumbled with his catch, the man next to him grunted. "That's a pretty sobering sentence. You don't often see it," and nodded down to a small notice on the back of the seat in front reading, "Your life belt is under the seat." Spencer laughed. "I'd certainly been sunk if I hadn't caught this bus," he said. "Oh, pretty keen fan, eh?" "Fan?" Spencer remembered that this was a charter flight for a ball game. No, he said hastily. "I hadn't given the game a thought. I hate to admit it, but I'm rushing off to Vancouver to keep a business appointment. I'd sure like to see that game, but it's out of the question, I'm afraid." His companion lowered his voice as conspiratorially as possible against the rising note of the engines. "I shouldn't say that too loudly if I were you. This plane's crammed with squareheads who are going to Vancouver with one purpose only, and that's to root like hell for their boys and roar damnation and defiance at the enemy. They're quite likely to do you harm if you use such a light tone about it." Spencer chuckled again and leaned out from his seat to look round the crowded cabin. There was evidence in plenty of a typical, noisy, roistering, but good-natured party of sports fans. Behind them, 4 supporters were pouring rye into paper tumblers and preparing to make a night of it by arguing the respective merits of various players. Spencer turned to the man beside him. "I sound like a heretic," he said conversationally, "but I must confess that I'm on my way to the coast on a sales trip, and a mighty important one at that." His companion showed a polite interest. "What do you sell?" he inquired. "Trucks. Lots of trucks." "Trucks, eh? I thought they were sold by dealers." "Well, so they are. I get called for when a deal's cooking that involves maybe 30 to 100 trucks. Hey, if you want 40 or 50 trucks today, I can give you a good discount. You feel like running a fleet?" The man beside him laughed. "Sorry, no. Couldn't use that many, I'm afraid. Bit outside my usual line of work." "What line of work's that?" asked Spencer. "Medicine." "Doctor, eh?" "Yes, a doctor, and therefore no use to you in the disposal of trucks." Leaning back on the headrest of his seat, Spencer said, "Well, I'm glad to have you around, Doctor. If I can't sleep, you can prescribe me a sedative." As he spoke, the engines thundered to full power, the whole aircraft vibrating as it strained against the wheel brakes. The doctor put his mouth to Spencer's ear and bellowed, "A sedative would do you no good in this racket. I never could understand why they have to make this noise before takeoff." Spencer nodded. Then, when after a few seconds of the roar had subsided sufficiently for him to make himself heard without much trouble, he said, "It's the usual run-up for the engines. It's always done before the plane actually starts its takeoff. Each engine has 2 magnetos, in case one packs in during the flight, and in the run-up, each engine in turn is open to full throttle and each of the mags tested separately. When the pilot satisfied himself that they're running okay, he takes off, but not before. Airlines have to be fussy that way, thank goodness." "You sound as if you know a bit about it." "No, not really. I used to fly fighters in the war 13 years ago. I reckon I've forgotten most of it." A powerful thrust in the back of their seats told them the aircraft was gathering speed on the runway. Almost immediately, a slight lurch indicated that they were airborne, and the engine settled back to a steady hum. "You may unfasten your safety belts," announced the public address. "Smoke if you wish." "Never sorry when that bit's over," grunted the doctor, releasing his catch and accepting a cigarette. "Thanks. By the way, I'm Baird. Bruno Baird." "Glad to know you, Doc. I'm Spencer, plain George Spencer, with the Fulbright Motor Company." For some time, the 2 men lapsed into silence, absently watching their cigarette smoke rise slowly in the cabin until it was caught by the air conditioning stream and sucked away. The 4 in the seats behind were starting their 3rd paper-enclosed round of rye. 3 were of the usual type, beefy, argumentative, aggressive, out to enjoy themselves with all the customary restraints cast aside for 2 memorable days. The 4th was a short, thin, lean-featured man of lugubrious expression and indeterminate age who spoke with a full-round Lancashire accent. "Here's to Lions tomorrow," he called, raising his paper cup in yet another toast to their heroes. His friends acknowledged the rubric solemnly. One of them, his coat lapel displaying a badge which appeared to depict a mangy alley cat in rampant mood, but presumably represented the king of beasts himself, passed round his cigarette case and remarked, not for the first time, "Never thought we'd make it, though. When we had to wait in Toronto with that fog around, I said to myself, Andy, I said, there's one bit of hell-raising you're going to have to miss. Still, We're only a few hours late for all that, and, well, we can always sleep on the plane." "Well, not before we eat, though, I hope," said one of the others. "I'm starving. When do they bring round the grub?" "Well, it should be along soon, I reckon. They usually serve dinner about 8, but everything's been put behind with that hold-up." "Never mind. Have a drink while you wait," suggested the Lancashire man, who rejoiced in the nickname of Ot-Pot, holding out the bottle of rye. "Go easy, boy. We haven't got too much." There's plenty more where this came from. Come on now, it'll help you sleep." In the tiny but well-appointed galley, stewardess Janet Benson prepared for dinner, a belated meal that she should have served over 2 hours earlier. Waitressing was the least attractive part of a stewardess's duties, and Janet knew that she was in for a very exhausting hour catering for the stomachs of a plane load of hungry people. But nevertheless, she felt confident and happy. Forward, on the flight deck, Captain Dunning stretched himself in his seat, flexing his muscles and blew out through the luxuriant growth of his mustache in an unconscious manner that his crew knew well. He looked older than his 31 years. "How are the cylinder head temperatures on number 3 engine, Pete?" he asked, his eyes flickering momentarily to the first officer. Pete stirred and glanced at the panel. "Okay now, Skip. I had it checked at Winnipeg, but they couldn't find anything wrong. Seems to have righted itself. It's not heating up now." "Good." Dunn peered ahead at the night sky. "With a bit of luck, it'll be a clear run through," he commented. "The Met report was reasonable for a change. Not often you keep to the original flight plan on this joyride. You planning to take in this ball game in Vancouver if there's time to rest up first?" The first officer hesitated before answering. "I don't know yet," he answered. "I'll see how it works out." The captain looked sharply at him. "What do you mean?" "See how what works out? If you got your eyes on Janet, you can take 'em off again. She's too young to come under the corrupting influence of a young Casanova like you." Few people looked less deserving of this description than the fresh-faced, thoughtful-eyed first officer, still in his 20s. "Go easy, Skipper," he protested, coloring. "I never corrupted anyone in my life." "Jeepers, that's a likely story." "Well, don't aim to start with Janet," the captain grinned. 12 feet away from them, on the other side of the sliding door, the subject of their conversation was collecting orders for the evening meal. She was fully occupied for the next half hour in preparing and serving. Eventually, everyone who felt like eating had been served with a main course, and she was free to pick up the telephone in the galley and press the intercom buzzer. "Flight deck," came the voice of Pete. "I'm finally serving dinner," said Janet. "Better late than never. What'll it be, lamb chop or grilled salmon?" "Hold it." She could hear him putting the question to the captain. "Janet, Skipper says he'll have the lamb—" "No, just a sec. He's changed his mind. Is the fish good?" "Well, looks okay to me," said Janet chirpily. "Had no complaints." "Skipper'll take salmon, then. You better make it 2. Big helpings, mind. We're growing boys." She quickly arranged the 2 trays and took them forward, balancing them with practiced ease against the almost imperceptible movements of the aircraft. Pete had come back to open the sliding door for her and relieved her of 1 tray. The captain had completed his switch over to automatic pilot and was now halfway through his routine radio check with control at Winnipeg. He reached for his log sheet, made an entry, then slid his seat back so that he was well clear of the controls, but still within easy reach of them if it were necessary for him to take them over again quickly. Pete was starting to eat, a tray resting on a pillow laid across his knees. "Shan't be long, Skip," he said. "Well, there's no hurry," replied Dunn. He turned to the stewardess, who was waiting in the shadow behind the seat. "Everything okay at the back, Janet? How are the football fans?" Janet shrugged. "They're very quiet now. That long way to Toronto must have tired them out. 4 of them been knocking back rye pretty steadily, but there's been no need to speak to them about it. It'll help keep them quiet. It looks like being a peaceful, easy night, fingers crossed. How's the weather?" "Oh, now, let's see. General fog east of the mountains, extending nearly as far as Manitoba. There's nothing to bother us up there, though. It should be a smooth ride all the way to the coast." "Well, good. Keep Junior here off the controls while I serve coffee, won't you?" She slipped away before Pete could retort, made her way through the passenger deck taking orders for coffee, and within a short while brought a tray up forward to the pilots. Dunn had by that time eaten his dinner, and he now drained his coffee with satisfaction. Pete had taken the controls and was intent on the instrument dials as the captain got to his feet. "Keep her steaming, Pete. I'll just tuck the customers up for the night." Pete nodded without turning around. Right, Skipper. The captain followed Janet out into the brightly lit passenger section, blinking, and stopped first at the seats occupied by Spencer and Baird. "Good evening," said Dunn. "Everything all right?" Baird looked up. "Why, sure, thanks. Very nice meal. We're ready for it, too." "Well, I hope you have a comfortable night," said Dunn. "The stewardess will bring you some rugs." He passed on down the aisle, having a few words with each of the passengers. He reached the whiskey-drinking quartet and politely forbade them any further consumption of liquor that night. "You know," he told them with a reproving grin, "this sort of thing isn't permitted anyway. Just don't let me see any more bottles or you'll have to get out and walk." "Any objection to cards?" inquired one of the party, holding a flask to the nearest light and turning down the corners of his mouth at the small amount of nectar that remained. "Not in the least," said Dunn, "so long as you don't disturb the other passengers." "Pity the poor captain," said the man from Lancashire. "What's it like taking a massive job like this through tonight?" "Routine," said Dunn. "Just plain, dull routine." "Comes to that every flight, just routine, I suppose." "Well, yes, I guess so. That's so. Until something happens, eh?" There was an outburst of chuckles in which Dunning joined before moving on. Only the Lancastrian, through the haze of his evening's drinking, looked temporarily thoughtful at his own words. The captain had almost completed his rounds and was enjoying a few moments' relaxed chaffing with one of the passengers, a little man who appeared to have traveled with him before. While he'd been speaking, his eyes had been fixed on the stewardess, further along the aisle, who was bending over a woman, the palm of her hand on the passenger's forehead. As he approached, the woman, who lay rather than sat in her seat, slumped back against the headrest, suddenly grimaced. Her eyes contracted as if with pain. The captain touched the stewardess lightly on the arm. "Anything wrong, Miss Benson?" he asked. Janet straightened. The lady's feeling a little under the weather, Captain," she said very quietly. "I'll get her some aspirin. Be back in a moment." Dunn took her place, leaned over the woman and the man beside her. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said sympathetically. "What seems to be the trouble?" The woman stared up at him. I don't know," she said in a small voice. "It seemed to hit me all of a sudden, just a few minutes ago. I feel sick and dizzy, and there's an awful pain down here." She indicated her stomach. Dunn said gently, "I'm sure the stewardess will be able to help you. Try to relax as much as you can. If it's any comfort, I can tell you it looks like being a calm trip." He moved aside for Janet. "Now here we are," said the stewardess, handing down the pills. "Try these." Dunn passed back down the aisle and waited for Janet in the galley. "Who are they?" he asked when the stewardess returned. "Mr. and Mrs. Childer, John Childer. She was all right 15 minutes ago." "Well, you'd better let me know if she gets any worse, and I'll radio ahead." Janet looked at him quickly. "Why? What are you thinking?" "I don't know. I don't like the look of her. It could be air sickness or just a bilious attack, I suppose, but it seems to have hit her pretty hard." The captain looked faintly worried, his fingers drumming absently on the metal draining board. "Have we a doctor on the passenger list?" "No one who's entered is a doctor," replied Janet. "But I could ask around." Dunn shook his head. "Don't disturb them now. Most of them are getting down to sleep. Let me know how she is in half an hour or so." Then he continued forward, closed the door of the flight deck behind him, and slid into his seat. He took off his peaked hat and put on the large earphones and then the boom microphone. Pete was flying manually. Scattered banks of clouds seemed to rush at the forward windows, envelop them momentarily, and then disappear. "Cumulonimbus building up," commented the first officer. "Getting to the rough stuff, ain't?" said Dunn. "Looks like it." "I'll take it. We'd better try to climb on top. Ask for 20,000, will you?" "Shan't be sorry when we're clear of this muck," remarked the first officer. Dunn didn't answer, his eyes glued on the dials in front of him. Neither of the pilots heard the stewardess enter. She touched the captain on the shoulder. "Captain," she said urgently, but keeping her voice well under control, "that woman, she's worse already, and I have another passenger sick now, one of the men." Dunn did not turn to her. He stretched up an arm and switched on the landing lights. Ahead of them, the sharp beams cut into the driving rain and snow. "I can't come right now, Janet," he replied as he worked. "You'd better do as we said and see if we can find a doctor, and make sure all the seat belts are fastened. This may get pretty rough. I'll come as soon as I can." "Yes, Captain." Emerging from the flight deck, Janet called out in a voice just loud enough to carry to the rows of passengers, "Fasten your seat belts, please. Maybe getting a little bumpy." She leaned over the first two passengers to her right, blinking up at her half asleep. "Excuse me," she said casually, "but do either of you gentlemen happen to be a doctor?" The man nearest her shook his head. "Oh, sorry, no," he grunted. "Is there something wrong?" "Oh, nothing serious." In the next row, Janet shook Spencer gently by the shoulder. He opened one eye, then both. "I'm very sorry to wake you, sir," she said. "But is anyone here a doctor?" Spencer gathered himself. "Doctor? No, I guess not, miss." She nodded and made to move on. "Well, just a moment, though," he stopped her. "I seem to remember, yes, of course he is. This gentleman besides me is a doctor." "Oh, thank goodness," breathed the stewardess. "Would you wake him, please?" "Sure." Spencer looked up at her as he nudged the recumbent form next to him. "Someone's ill, huh?" "Feeling a little unwell," said Janet. "Come on, Doc, wake up," Spencer said heartily. The doctor shook his head, grunted, then snapped awake. "Are you a doctor, sir?" asked Janet anxiously. "Yes. Yes, I'm Dr. Baird. Why, what's wrong?" "We have two passengers who are quite sick. Would you take a look at them, please?" "Sick? Yes, certainly." Spencer stood up to let the doctor out. "Where are they?" Baird asked, rubbing his eyes. "I think you'd better see the woman first, Doctor," said Janet, leading the way and at the same time calling out quietly, "Fasten your seat belts, please," as she passed along. Mrs. Childer was now as prostrate as the seat allowed. Shivers of pain racked her body. She breathed heavily with long, shuddering gasps. Her hair was wet with sweat. Baird stood studying her for a moment. Then he knelt and took her wrist. "This gentleman's a doctor," said Janet. "I'm glad to see you, Doctor," Childer said fervently. The woman opened her eyes. "Doctor." She made an effort to speak, her lips trembling. "Just relax," said Baird, his eyes on his watch. He released her wrist, felt in his jacket, and took out a pocket flashlight. "Open your eyes wide," he ordered gently, and examined each eye in turn in the bright pencil of light. "Oh, now. Any pain?" The woman nodded. "Where? Here?" Here." As he palpated her abdomen, she stiffened suddenly, choking back a cry of pain. He replaced the blanket, felt her forehead, then stood up. "Is this lady your wife?" he asked Childer. "Yes, Doctor." "Has she complained of anything in addition to the pain?" "She's been very sick. She's throwing up everything." "When did it start?" "Not long, I guess. Childer looked helplessly at Janet. "It's all come on suddenly." Baird nodded reflectively. He moved away, taking Janet by the arm and speaking very quietly so as not to be overheard by the nearby passengers who were staring up at them. "I think you'd better go to the captain," said Baird. "Please tell him we should land at once. This woman has to be gotten to a hospital. Ask to have an ambulance waiting." "Very well, Doctor. While I'm gone, will you take a look at the other sick passenger? He's complaining of the same sickness and pains." Baird looked at her sharply. "The same pains, you say? Where is he?" Janet led him forward to where the sick man sat, bent over, retching, supported by his friend in the next seat. Baird crouched down to look at his face. He made a quick examination, asked a few questions, and rose to find Janet and the captain standing beside him. "Keep him warm. Get more blankets round him," he told Janet. The captain motioned him to follow down to the galley. Immediately they were alone, Baird demanded, "How quickly can we land, Captain?" "Well, that's the trouble," said Dunn briefly. "We can't." Baird stared at him. "Why?" "Well, it's the weather. I've just checked by radio. There's low cloud and fog right over the prairies this side of the mountains. Calgary's shut in completely, and we'll have to go on through to the coast." Baird thought for a moment. "What about turning back?" he asked. Dunn shook his head, his face taut in the soft glow of the lights. "That's out, too. Winnipeg's closed down with fog shortly after we left. Anyway, it'd be quicker to go on now." Baird made up his mind. "Then I'll have to do what I can do for these people until we arrive at Vancouver. I'll need my bag. Do you think it can be reached? I checked it at Toronto. Well, we can try, said the captain. I hope it's near the top. Let me have your tags, Doctor. There are 2 bags, Captain. It's the smaller one I want. There isn't much equipment in it, just a few things I always carry around, but they'll help. He'd barely finished speaking before the aircraft gave a violent lurch. It sent the 2 men sprawling to the far wall. There was a loud, persistent buzzing. The captain was on his feet first and sprang to the intercom telephone. "Captain here," he rapped out. "What's wrong, Pete?" The voice of the first officer was struggling and painful. "I'm sick. Sick. Come quickly." "You better come with me," said Dunn to the doctor. As they burst into the flight deck, it was only too apparent that the first officer was very sick. His face was a mask of perspiration. He was slumped in his seat, clutching the control column with what was obviously all his strength. "Get him out of there," directed the captain urgently. Baird and Janet, who had followed the men in, seized the co-pilot and lifted him out and away from the controls, while Dunn slipped into his own seat and took the column in his hands. "There's a seat at the back of the flight deck for when we carry a radio operator," he told him. "Put him there." His voice was tense. He asked, "Doctor, what is it? What's happening?" "Not sure," said Baird grimly. "There is a common denominator to these attacks. There has to be. The most likely thing's the food." "What was it you had for dinner?" "The main course was a choice of meat or fish," said Janet. You probably remember, Doctor, you had meat," cut in Baird. "About what, 2-3 hours ago?" "Well, what did he have?" He indicated the first officer. Janet's face began to register alarm. "Fish," she almost whispered. "Do you remember what the other 2 passengers had?" "Well, no, I don't think so." "Well, go back quickly and find out, will you, please?" The stewardess hurried out, her face pale. Baird knelt beside the first officer, who sat swaying with the motion of the aircraft, his eyes closed. "Try to relax," he said quietly. "I'll give you something in a few minutes that'll help the pain. Here." He reached up and pulled down a blanket from the rack. "You'll feel better if you stay warm." Janet returned. "Doctor," she spoke rapidly, hardly able to get the words out quickly enough. "I've checked both these passengers. They both had salmon. There are 3 others complaining of pains. Now, can you come?" "Of course. But I'll need that bag of mine." Dunn called over his shoulder. "Look, I can't leave here now, Doctor, but I'll see that you get it immediately. Janet, take these tags. Get one of the passengers to help you dig out the smaller of the doctor's 2 bags, will you?" Janet took the tags from him and turned to the doctor to speak again, but Dunn continued. "I'm going to radio Vancouver and report what's happening. Is there anything you want me to add?" "Yes," said Baird. "Say we have 3 serious cases of suspected food poisoning and that there seem to be others developing. You can say we're not sure, but we suspect that the poisoning could have been caused by the fish served on board." "I remember now," exclaimed Dunn. "That food didn't come from the caterers who usually supply the airlines. Our people had to get it from some other outfit because we were so late getting into Winnipeg." "Tell them that, Captain," said Baird. "That's what they'll need to know." "Doctor, please," Janet implored him. "I do wish you'd come and see Mrs. Childer. She seems to have collapsed altogether." Baird stepped to the door. The lines in his face had deepened, but his eyes, as he held Janet's with them, were as steady as a rock. "See that the passengers are not alarmed," he instructed. He pushed back the door for her, then stopped her as something occurred to him. "By the way, what did you eat for dinner?" "I had meat," the young stewardess answered him. Thank heaven for that, then." Janet smiled and made to go on again, but he gripped her suddenly, very hard, by the arm. "I suppose the captain had meat, too." He shot the question at her. She looked up at him as if at the same time trying to both remember and grasp the implications of what he'd asked. And suddenly shock and realization flooded into her. She almost fell against him, her eyes dilated with an immense and overpowering fear. Baird retraced his steps forward. They were now in level flight above the turbulence. "Captain," he said, leaning over the empty co-pilot seat. Dunn looked round, his face drawn and colorless in the moon glare. "Yes, Doctor, what is it?" "I presume you ate after the other officer did." "Yeah, that's so. How long after?" Dunn's eyes narrowed. "About half an hour, I'd say. Maybe a little bit more, but not much." The point of the doctor's question suddenly hit him. He sat upright with a jerk and slapped the top of the control column with the flat of his hand. "Holy smoke, that's right. I had fish, too." "Do you feel all right?" The captain nodded. Yes, I feel okay. Good. Relief showed in Baird's voice. As soon as I've got my bag, I'll give you an emetic. Will that get rid of it? Well, it depends. You can't have digested it all yet. Anyway, it doesn't follow that everyone who ate fish will be affected. Logic doesn't enter into these things. You could be the one to avoid trouble. I'd better be, muttered Dunn, staring now into the moon glow ahead. Now listen, said Baird. Is there any way of locking the controls on this airplane? Why, yes, said Dunn. There's the automatic pilot, but that wouldn't get us down. I suggest you switch it on, whatever you do, just in case. If you do happen to feel ill, yell for me immediately. Look, for heaven's sake, hurry without a medic. I can't take any chances flying this ship. Benson is hurrying. Unless I'm mistaken, there are at least 2 people back there in a deep state of shock. Now, one more thing, Baird said, looking straight at the captain. Are you absolutely certain that we've no other course but to go on? Certain, answered Dunn instantly. I've checked and double-checked. Baird left without another word. Dunn took a deep breath, thinking over what had been said and searching in his mind for a possible course of action. Putting out his right hand, he flicked the switches on the automatic pilot panel, waiting until each control became fully oriented and the appropriate indicator light gleamed to show that the next stage of the switching over could be started. Across the great spread of the dual instrument panel, the dozens of needles each registered its own particular story. He reached for the microphone that hung on its hook beside his head. He quickly clipped it to his neck and adjusted the padded earphones. The boom mic swung round at his touch so that the thin steel curve almost caressed his cheek. The switch was at send, and his voice sounded calm and unhurried. Hello, Vancouver Control. This is Maple Leaf Charter Flight 714. I have an emergency message. His earphone crackled instantly. Maple Leaf Charter Flight 714, come in, please. Vancouver Control, this is Flight 714. Listen. We have 3 serious cases of suspected food poisoning on board, including the first officer and possibly others. When we land, we shall want ambulances and medical help standing by. Please warn hospitals near the airfield. We're not sure, but we think the poisoning may have been caused by the fish served on board at dinner. You'd better put a ban on all food coming from the same source until the trouble's been definitely located. We understand that owing to our late arrival at Winnipeg, the food was not supplied by the regular airline contractor. Please check. Is that understood? He listened to the acknowledgement, his eyes gazing bleakly at the frozen sea of cloud below and ahead. Back in the body of the aircraft, Dr. Baird tucked fresh dry blankets round the limp form of Mrs. Childer. As he watched her, she was seized with a fresh paroxysm. Her eyes did not open. Baird spoke to her husband. Keep her mopped up and dry as you can, and warm. She must be warm. Childer reached up and grabbed the doctor by the wrist. For God's sake, doctor, what's happening? His voice was shrill. She's pretty bad, isn't she? Baird looked again at the woman. Her breathing was rapid and shallow. Yes, he said. She is. Well, can't we do something for her? Give her something. Baird shook his head. She needs drugs we haven't got, antibiotics. There is nothing we can do right now but keep her warm. Doctor, someone shouted. Can you come here, please? Wait a minute, Baird called back. I'll see everyone in town who wants me. The stewardess hurried towards him, holding a leather bag. Good girl, said Baird. That's the one. Not that I can do much. His voice trailed away as he thought hard. Where's your PA system, he asked. I'll show you, said Janet. She led the way after the galley and pointed to a small microphone. How is Mrs. Childer, doctor? She asked. Baird pursed his lips. Don't let's pretend otherwise. She's seriously ill, he said. And if I'm not very much mistaken, there are others who'll be as bad before long. Do you still think it's food poisoning? Janet's cheeks were very pale. Tolerably certain. Staphylococcal, I'd say, though some of the symptoms out there could indicate even worse. Then again, the poisoning could have been caused by Salmonella bacilli. Who can say without proper diagnosis? Are you going to give round an emetic? Yes. Of course, except to those who are already sick, that's all I can do. What we'll probably need are antibiotics. He thought for a moment, then pressed the button of the microphone, holding it close. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? First of all, I should introduce myself. My name's Baird, and I'm a doctor. Some of you are wondering what this malady is that's stricken our fellow passengers. Well, as far as I can tell, with the limited facilities at my disposal, we have several cases of food poisoning on board, and by deduction, a deduction that is yet to be confirmed, believe the cause of it to be the fish which was served to some of us at dinner. An excited hubbub broke out at his words. Now listen to me, please, he said. There is no cause for alarm. I repeat, there's no cause for alarm. The passengers who have suffered these attacks are being cared for by the stewardess and myself, and the captain has radioed ahead for more medical help to be standing by when we land. If you ate fish for dinner, it doesn't necessarily follow that you're going to be affected too. There's seldom any hard and fast rule about this sort of thing, and it's perfectly possible that you'll be entirely immune. However, we are going to take some precautions, and the stewardess and I are going to come round to you all. I want you to tell us if you ate fish. Remember, only if you ate fish. If you did, we'll tell you how you can help yourselves. Now, if you'll all settle down, we'll begin right away. Baird took his finger off the button and turned to Janet. All we can really do right now is to give immediate first aid, he said. Janet nodded. You mean the pills, Doctor? There are two things we can do. We don't know definitely what the source of the poisoning is, but we can assume it's been taken internally. So to begin with, everyone who had fish must drink several glasses of water. I mean, those who are not too ill, of course. There aren't enough pills in my bag to go around. We'll just have to use salt. Have you plenty of that? I've only got a few small packets that go with the lunches, but we can break them open. Good. Stepping out of the galley, Baird practically cannoned a lean, lugubrious Englishman called Otpot. Anything I can do, Doctor? His voice was concerned. Baird allowed himself a smile. Thanks. First, what did you have for dinner? Meat, thank heaven, breathed Otpot fervently. Right. Not going to worry about you then for a moment. Will you help the stewardess to hand water around to the passengers who are sick? I want them to drink at least 3 glasses of water if they can, more if possible. The control room at Vancouver, where Dunn's emergency call began to come through, presented a scene of suppressed excitement. In front of the radio panel, an operator wearing headphones transcribed Dunn's incoming message straight onto the typewriter, pausing only to reach over and punch an alarm bell on his desk. He carried on imperturbably as the second man appeared behind him, craning over his shoulder to read the words as they were pounded onto the sheet of paper in the typewriter. The newcomer, summoned by the bell, was the airport controller. He got halfway through the message, then stepped sharply back, cracking an order over his shoulder to the telephone operator at the far side of the room. Get me air traffic control quickly, then clear the teletype circuit to Winnipeg. Priority message. The controller picked up a phone, waited a few seconds, then said, Vancouver controller here. His voice was deceptively unhurried. Maple Leaf charter flight 714 from Winnipeg to Vancouver reports an emergency. Serious food poisoning among the passengers, and I mean serious. First officer's down with it, too. You better clear all levels below him for priority approach and landing. Can do? Good. ETA's 5:05. The controller glanced at the wall clock. It read 2:15. Right, well, we'll keep you posted. He pushed down the telephone cradle with his thumb, keeping it there as he barked at the teletype operator. Got Winnipeg yet? Good. Send this message. Starts. Controller Winnipeg. Urgent. Maple Leaf charter flight 714 reports serious food poisoning among passengers and crew, believed due to fish served dinner on flight. Imperative. Check source and suspend all other services originating from same place. Understand source was not, repeat, not regular airline caterer. That's all. He swung round to the telephone switchboard again. Get me the local manager of Maple Leaf Charter. Burdick's his name. After that, I want the city police, senior officer on duty. He leaned over the radio operator's shoulder again and finished reading the now completed message. Acknowledge that, Greg. Tell him that all altitudes below him are being cleared and that they'll be advised of landing instructions later. We'll want further news later on the condition of those passengers, too. The controller scooped up the telephone again, holding it with one hand as the other pulled at his necktie, worrying the knot free. Hello, Burdick. Controller here. Look, we've got an emergency on one of your flights, 714 ex-Toronto and Winnipeg. See here, you better come over as soon as you can. Within 5 minutes, Harry Burdick had arrived, puffing into the room. Where's the message? He grunted. He ran his eye quickly over the sheet of paper the radio operator handed him. How's the weather at Calgary? He asked the controller. Be quicker to go in there, wouldn't it? No good, I'm afraid. There's fog right down to the grass everywhere east of the Rockies as far as Manitoba. They'll have to come through. Well, you say you got medical help coming, asked Burdick. Yes, replied the controller. City police are working on that. They'll alert the hospitals and see to the arrangements when we get the plane here. Burdick clicked a fat finger. Hey, that message now. They say the first officer's down, so presumably the captain passed the message. Is he affected at all? You better ask, controller. Well, and while you're at it, I should check whether there's a doctor on board. You never know. Tell them we're getting medical advice here in case they need it. The controller nodded and picked up the stand microphone from the radio desk. Before he could begin, Burdick called. Say, suppose the captain gets sick, controller. Who's gonna... He left the sentence unfinished as the level gaze of the man opposite met his. Nearly 4 miles above the earth, the aircraft held her course. Like a monstrous weed, fear was taking root in the minds of most of the passengers. There were some who probably still failed to realize exactly what was going on, but most of them, especially those who could hear the groans and retching of the ones who were ill, felt the presence of a terrible crisis. When Janet entered the flight deck, Dunn was completing a radio transmission. He signed off and gave her a strained grin. Neither of them was deluded by it. "Hello, Jan," he said. "How are things back there?" "So far, so good," said Janet as lightly as she could. She held out the pills. "Doctor says you're to drink as much as you can and take these. They'll make you feel a bit green." Janet looked anxiously down at him as he sat before the flickering panel of gauges and dials. "How do you feel?" she asked. His pallor, the beads of perspiration on his forehead, did not escape her. She prayed to herself that it was just the strain he was undergoing. "Me?" His tone was unnaturally hearty. "I'm fine. What about you? Had your pills yet?" "Well, I don't need any. I had chops for dinner." "You were wise." She smiled quickly at him and opened the door to the passenger deck. Baird was halfway along the starboard side, talking to a middle-aged couple who stared at him nervously. He handed them each a pill, which they accepted as gingerly as if it were high explosive. "Now, you'll be brought a jug of water. Drink 3 glasses each, 4 if you can manage 'em. Then take the pill. It'll make you sick, but that's what it's for. Don't worry about it. There are paper bags in the seat pockets." He moved along to the group of football fans who had earlier in the evening imbibed whiskey with such liberality. The quartet was now reduced in strength to 3, and one of these sat shivering in his shirt sleeves, a blanket drawn across his chest. His color was gray. "Keep this man warm," said Baird. "Has he had anything to drink?" "Well, that's a laugh," replied a man behind him, shuffling a pack of cards. "He must have downed a couple of pints of rye, if I'm any judge." "Before or after dinner?" "Well, both, I reckon." That's right," agreed another in the group, and I thought Harry could hold his liquor." "In this case, it's done him no harm," Baird said. "In fact, it's helped to dilute the poison, I don't doubt. Have any of you men got any brandy?" "Cleared mine up," said the man with the cards. "Wait a minute," said the other, leaning forward to get at his hip pocket. I might have some left in the flask. We gave it a good knocking waiting at Toronto." "Give him a few sips," instructed Baird. "Take it gently. Your friend is very ill." "Say, Doctor," said the man with the cards, "what's the score? Are we on schedule?" "As far as I know, yes." "Fancy this happening to old Andy. What about Hotpot, that English screwball? You drafted him?" "Yes, he's given us a hand." He felt Janet standing beside him. He questioned her with his eyes, sensing her to be on the edge of hysteria. 2 more passengers have been taken ill, Doctor, at the back there." "Are you sure it isn't just the pills?" "Oh, yes, I'm quite sure." "Right. I'll get to him straight away. Will you have another look at the first officer, Miss Benson? He might feel like a little water." He'd barely reached the 2 new cases and begun his examination before Janet was back again. "Doctor, I'm terribly worried. I think you ought to—" The buzz of the galley intercom cut across her words like a knife. She stood transfixed as the buzz continued without a break. Baird was the first to move. Moving with an agility quite foreign to him, he raced along the aisle and burst into the flight deck. The captain was rigid in his seat, sweat masking his face and streaking the collar of his uniform. One hand clutched at his stomach. The other was pressed on the intercom buzzer on the wall beside him. "Take it easy now," said Baird. "We'd better get you away from there." "I did what you said," Dunn gasped. Then he rolled his eyes up and collapsed. "Quick, Miss Benson," called Baird. "Help me get him out." Panting and struggling, they pulled Dunn's heavy body out of the pilot's seat and eased him onto the floor alongside the first officer. Barely audible, Janet whispered, "Doctor, what are we going to do?" "Let me ask you a question. How many passengers on board?
56.
How many fish dinners did you serve?
Janet struggled to remember. About 15, I think. More people had meat than fish, and some didn't eat at all, as it was so late.
I see.
Baird regarded her steadily. When he spoke again, his voice was harsh, almost belligerent.
Miss Benson, did you ever hear of long odds?
Janet tried to focus on what he was saying. Well, long odds? Yes, I suppose so. I don't know what it means.
I'll tell you, said Baird. It means this. Out of a total of 56, our one chance of survival depends on there being a person aboard this airline who's not only qualified to land it, but who also didn't have fish for dinner tonight. His words hung between them as they stood there, staring at each other.
I understand, Doctor, she said levelly.
Do you know of anyone aboard with any experience of flying?
She cast her mind over the passenger list, recalling the names. There's no one from the airline, she said. I don't know about anyone else. I suppose I'd better start asking.
Wait, he told her.
Yes?
She paused, her hand on the catch of the door. He snapped his fingers and turned to her. I've got it. I knew someone had spoken to me about airplanes. The young man in the seat next to mine. The one who joined us at the last minute at Winnipeg.
Mr. Spencer?
That's him. George Spencer. I forget exactly, but he seemed to know something about flying. Get him up here, will you?
Well, he just offered to help me, said Janet. So he must be unaffected by the food.
Yes, you're right, exclaimed Baird. We both had meat. Get him, Janet. He paced the narrow cabin nervously while she was gone, then knelt to feel the pulse of the captain lying prone and unconscious beside the first officer. At the first sound of the door behind him, he jumped to his feet, blocking the entrance. Spencer stood there, looking at him in bewilderment. Hello, Doc, the young man greeted him. Are you a pilot? Baird shot out, not moving. Well, a long time ago, in the war. Come in, said Baird. He stepped aside, closing the door quickly behind the young man. Spencer's head snapped up at the sight of the pilot's empty seat and the controls moving by themselves. Then he wheeled round to the two men stretched on the floor under their blankets. No, he gasped, not both of them. Yes, said Bert shortly. Both of them. Spencer seemed hardly able to believe his eyes.
But man alive, he stuttered. Well, when did it happen?
The captain went down a few minutes ago. They both had fish. Listen, can you fly this aircraft? And land it?
No, shock stabbed at Spencer's voice.
Definitely not. Not a chance. But you said you flew in the war, Bear insisted.
That was 13 years ago. I haven't touched a plane since, and I was on fighters. Tiny Spitfires about an eighth the size of this ship, and with only one engine.
You could have a go at it, Baird pressed. Spencer shook his head angrily.
I tell you, the idea is crazy, he snapped. You don't know what's involved. I wouldn't be able to take in a Spitfire now, let alone this.
The door opened, and Janet came into the flight deck. She glanced inquiringly at Spencer and then back at the doctor, her voice flat.
There's no one else, she said.
That's it, then, said the doctor. Spencer looked from the girl to the doctor, and he asked tensely,
You're quite sure there's no chance of either of the pilots recovering in time?
None at all, I'm afraid. Unless I can get them to hospital quickly, I can't even be sure of saving their lives.
It looks as if I don't have much choice, doesn't it? Spencer said.
That's right. Unless you'd rather we carried on until we're out of gas, probably halfway across the Pacific.
What are you going to tell the people back there? Asked Spencer, running his eye over the scores of gauges in front of him and racking his memory to recall some of the lessons he'd learned in the past that now seemed very far away.
For the moment, nothing, answered the doctor.
That's very wise, said Spencer dryly. He studied the bewildering array of instrument dials.
Can you do it?
I wouldn't know, Doc. I just wouldn't know. I've never seen a setup like this before in my life. I mean, where are we now? Where are we going?
From what the captain said, we're over the Rockies, replied Baird. He couldn't turn off course earlier because of the fog, so we're going through to Vancouver.
Well, We'll have to find out. Spencer looked about him in the soft glow. Where is the radio control, anyway? Janet pointed to a switch box above his head. I know they use that to talk to the ground, she told him. But I don't know which switches you have to set. Yes. Let's see. He peered at the box. Those are the frequency selectors. We better leave them where they are. What's this? Oh, transmit. He clicked over a switch, lighting up a small red bulb. Well, that's it. First blood to George. Now we're ready for business. Janet handed him a headset with a boom microphone attached. I know you press the button on the mic when you speak, she said. Adjusting the earphones, Spencer spoke to the doctor. Whatever happens, I'm going to need a second pair of hands up here in front. You've got your patients to look after, so I think the best choice is Miss Canada here. What do you say? Baird nodded. I agree. Is that all right, Janet? Well, I suppose so, but I know nothing of all this. Janet waved helplessly at the control panel. Good, said Spencer breezily. That makes two of us. Now sit down, make yourself comfortable. You better strap yourself in. You must have watched the pilots quite a lot. They've added a lot of gimmicks since my flying days. Janet struggled into the first officer's seat, taking care not to touch the control column as it swayed back and forth. There was an anxious knocking on the communication door. That's for me, said Baird. I must go back. Good luck. He left quickly. Alone with the stewardess, Spencer summoned up a grin. You okay? He asked. She nodded dumbly, preparing to put on a headset. The name's Janet, is it? Well, mine's George. Spencer's tone became serious. I won't fool you, Janet. This'll be tough. I know it. Let's see if I can send out a distress call here. Well, what's our flight number? 714. Right. Oh, here goes then. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Flight 714, Maple Leaf Air Charter, in distress. Come in, anyone. Over. He caught his breath as a voice responded immediately over the air. Hello, 714, this is Vancouver. We've been waiting to hear from you. Vancouver to all aircraft. This frequency now closed to all other traffic. Go ahead, 714. Thank you, Vancouver. 714, we are in distress. Both pilots and several passengers. How many passengers, Janet? It was 5 a few minutes ago. Maybe more now, though. Correction. At least 5 passengers are suffering from food poisoning. Both pilots are unconscious and in serious condition. We have a doctor with us who says that neither pilot can be revived to fly the aircraft. Did you get that, Vancouver? The voice cracked back instantly. Go ahead, 714, I'm reading you. Spencer took a deep breath. And now we come to the interesting bit. My name's Spencer, George Spencer. I'm a passenger on this airplane. Correction, I was a passenger. I'm now the pilot. For your information, I have about 1,000 hours total flying time, all of it on single-engine fighters. Also, I haven't flown an airplane for nearly 13 years, so you'd better get someone on this radio who can give me some instructions about flying this thing. Our altitude is 20,000, course 290, magnetic airspeed 210 knots, and that's the story. It's your move, Vancouver. Over. Vancouver to 714, stand by. In a few seconds, the air was alive again, the voice as measured and impersonal as before. Vancouver to Flight 714, please check with doctor on board for any possibility of either pilot recovering. This is important. Repeat, this is important. Spencer pressed his transmit button. Vancouver, this is Flight 714. Your message is understood, but no go, I'm afraid. The doctor says there's no possibility whatever of pilots recovering to make the landing. He says they're critically ill and may die unless they get hospital treatment soon. Over. There was a slight pause. Then, Vancouver Control to 714. Your message understood. Will you stand by, please? Roger, Vancouver, acknowledged Spencer and switched off again. He said to Janet, well, now we can only wait now while they think up what to do. Within the brightly lit control room, the atmosphere was tense with concentration. Replacing his telephone, the controller lit a cigarette. He turned to Burdick. Perched on the edge of a table, the plump manager of Maple Leaf Airlines had just finished consulting again the clipboard of information he held in his hands. Right, Harry, said the controller. His tone was that of a man running over his actions more to satisfy himself that everything had been done rather than to impart information to another. As of now, I'm holding all departures for the east. We've got nearly an hour in which to clear the present outgoing traffic in other directions, leaving plenty of time in hand. After that, everything scheduled outwards must wait, until afterwards anyway. Have you any pilots here at the airport? Burdick shook his head. Not one, he said. We'll have to get help. The controller thought rapidly. "Try Cross Canada. They must have some of their men based here. Explain the position. We'll need a man fully experienced with this type of aircraft who's capable of giving instructions over the air." "You think there's a chance?" "I don't know. But we've got to try. Can you suggest anything else?" "No," said Burdick. "I can't, but I sure don't envy him that job." The switchboard operator called. "City police again. Will you take them?" "Put 'em on," said the controller. "I'll see the Cross Canada people," said Burdick. "And I must ring Montreal and tell my chief what's happening." "Do it through the main board, will you?" asked the controller. "The one in here is getting snarled up." The fire chief is on his way," reported his assistant. I'm on to the Air Force now. They ask if they can give any assistance." "We'll let 'em know, but I don't think so. Thank 'em. Anyone got smokes?" "Here, sir." He accepted a cigarette and lit it. "Better send down for some. And coffee for everyone. We're going to need it." Burdick came back into the room, breathing noisily. "Cross Canada says their best man's Captain Trelhaven. They're ringing him right now. He's at home in bed, I suppose." "I've arranged for police escort if necessary." The controller crossed to the radio panel and picked up the stand microphone. He nodded to the dispatcher, who threw a switch to transmit. "Vancouver Control to Flight 714, he called. Spencer's voice, when he replied, spluttered from an amplifier extension high up in a corner of the room. Since his Mayday distress call, all his conversation had been channeled through the loudspeaker. 714 to Vancouver. I thought you were lost." "Vancouver to 714. This is the controller speaking. We are organizing help. We shall call you again very soon. Meanwhile, do nothing to interfere with the present set of the controls. Do you understand? Over." "Understood. Out." On the outskirts of the town, another telephone was ringing. An attractive redhead in a white embroidered nightdress reached for the telephone, then brought it to her ear. "Is this Mrs. Trelhaven?" demanded a crisp voice. "Yes. Who is it?" "Mrs. Trelhaven, may I speak to your husband?" He's not here." "Not there. Where can I find him, please?" "He's at his mother's place. His father's ill, and my husband's helping to sit with him." "Is it in town?" Yes, not far from here." She gave the telephone number. "Thank you. We'll ring him there." 2 miles away, Paul Trelhaven slept deeply. He was aroused by his arm being shaken. Immediately awake, he looked up to find his mother bending over him. "All right, Mother," he said heavily. "I'll take over now." "No, son, it isn't that. Dad's sleeping like a baby. It's the airport on the telephone. I told them you were trying to snatch some rest, but they insisted." "Okay, I'll come." He padded in stocking feet to the door and out to the telephone in the hall. "Trelhaven," he said. "Paul, this is Jim Bryant." The words were clipped, urgent. "I was getting really worried. We need you, Paul, but bad. Can you come over right away?" "Why, what's up?" "We're in real trouble here. There's a Maple Leaf charter. It's an Empress C-6, one of the refitted jobs, on its way from Winnipeg with a number of passengers, and both pilots seriously ill with food poisoning." "What? Both pilots?" "That's right. It's a top emergency. Some fellow's at the controls who hasn't flown for years. Fortunately, the ship's on autopilot. Maple Leaf hasn't got a man here, and we want you to come in and talk her down. You think you can do it?" "Oh, great Scott, I don't know. It's a tall order." Trelhaven looked at his wristwatch. "What's the ETA?" 5:05. "But that's under 2 hours. Well, we gotta move. Look, I'm on the south side of town." "What's your address?" Trelhaven gave it. "We'll have a police car pick you up in a few minutes. When you get here, go straight on up to the control room." "Right. I'm on my way." At the main reception building, Trelhaven was out of the car, through the doors, and had crossed the concourse before the wail of the siren died. Waving aside the commissionaire who hurried across to meet him, he made his way directly to the control room in the administration block. He entered control as Burdick was speaking anxiously and deferentially on the telephone. "No, sir, he isn't qualified. He flew as single-engine fighters in the wars. Nothing since." The controller stepped quickly over to greet Trelhaven. "I'm certainly glad to see you, Captain," he said. Trelhaven nodded towards Burdick. "Is that the fella in the Empress he's talking about?" he asked. "Yes." Trelhaven took from the dispatcher the clipboard of messages from 714 and read them carefully. With a quiet request, "Weather." He then consulted the latest meteorological reports. This done, he laid the papers down, raised his eyebrows somberly at the controller, and produced his pipe, which he then proceeded to fill. "What do you think?" the controller asked Trelhaven. The pilot shrugged without answering and picked up the clipboard again. His face was set in deep lines as he read the messages again, drawing steadily on his pipe. A young man backed into the room, holding the door open with his leg as he maneuvered a tray bearing cardboard cartons of coffee. He handed a carton to the controller and set another down in front of Trelhaven. The pilot ignored it. "Our ETA is 5:05 Pacific time," Burdick was saying with increasing exasperation. "I'll call you as soon as I know anything more. Yes. Goodbye." Putting down the telephone and turning to Trelhaven, he said, "Thank you very much for coming, Captain. Have you got it all?" Trelhaven held up the clipboard. "It's the whole story?" "That's everything we know. Now, I want you to get on the horn and talk this guy down. You'll have to let him get the feel of the airplane on the way. You're going to have to give him a landing check. You'll have to talk him in on the approach. And so help me, you have to talk him right down to the ground. Can you do it?" "I can't perform a miracle," said Trelhaven evenly. "You know that the chances of a man who's only flown fighter airplanes landing a 4-engine passenger ship are pretty slim, to say the least." "Of course I know it," Burdick exploded. "But you have any other ideas?" "Nope," Trelhaven said slowly. "Guess not. I just wanted to be sure you knew what we were getting into." "Okay, then, let's get started." He walked over to the radio operator. "Can you work 714 direct?" "Yes, Captain. Reception's good. We can call them any time." "Do it, then." The operator switched to transmit. "Flight 714, this is Vancouver. Do you read? Over." "Yes, Vancouver," came Spencer's voice through the amplifier. "We hear you clearly. Go ahead, please." The operator handed the stand microphone to Trelhaven. "Okay, Captain, it's all yours." Holding the microphone in his hand, its cable trailing to the floor, Trelhaven turned his back on the other men in the room. "Hello, Flight 714, he said. "This is Vancouver. My name's Paul Trelhaven. I'm a cross-Canada Airlines captain. My job is to help you fly this airplane in. We shouldn't have too much trouble. I see that I'm talking to George Spencer. I'd like to hear a little more about your flying experience, George." Spencer's mouth was so dry when he replied that at first he could hardly speak. He cleared his throat. "Hello, Vancouver. 714 here. Glad to have you along, Captain. But let's not kid each other, please. I think we both know the situation. My flying up to now has been entirely on single-engine aircraft, Spitfires and Mustangs, and I'd say about 1,000 hours in all. That was 13 years ago, and I've touched nothing since. Do you understand that? Over." "Don't worry about that, George. It's like riding a bicycle. You never forget it. Stand by, will you?" In the Vancouver control, Trelhaven pressed the cutout button on the arm of the microphone in his hand and looked at a slip of paper the controller held out for him to read. "Try to get him on this course," said the controller. "The Air Force have just sent in a radar check." He paused. "Sounds pretty screwed up, doesn't he?" "Yeah, who wouldn't be in his shoes?" Trelhaven grimaced reflectively. "We got to give him confidence," he said. "Without that, there isn't a chance. Whatever happens, he mustn't lose his nerve." He released the cutout. 714, this is Trelhaven. You still on autopilot, right?" "Yes, that's so, Captain," came the reply. "All right, George. In a minute you can disengage the autopilot and get the feel of the controls. When you've had a bit of practice with him, you're going to change course a little bit. Now listen very carefully, though, before you touch him. When you start handling the airplane, the controls will seem very heavy and sluggish compared with a fighter. Don't let it worry you. It's quite normal. You got a lot of airplane up there, so take it nice and steady. Watch your airspeed all the time you're flying, and don't let it fall below 120 knots while your wheels and flaps are up, otherwise you'll stall. I'll repeat that. Make absolutely sure at all times that your airspeed doesn't fall below 120 knots. Now, one other thing. Do you have someone up there who can work the radio and leave you free for flying?" "Yes, Vancouver. I have the stewardess here with me, and she'll take over the radio now. It's all yours, Janet." "Hello, Vancouver. This is Stewardess Janet Benson. Over." "Why, it's you, Janet," said Trelhaven. "I'd know that voice anywhere. You're going to talk to George for me, are you? Good. Now, Janet, I want you to keep your eyes on that airspeed indicator. Any time the ASI shows a reading near 120, you tell George instantly. Is that clear, Janet?" "Yes, Captain. I understand." "Back to you, George. Take this slowly and smoothly. I want you to unlock the autopilot. Now, it's clearly marked on the control column. And take the airplane yourself, now holding her straight and level." Spencer put his right forefinger over the autopilot release button on the control column. "Tell him I'm switching over now," he told Janet. She repeated the message. His hand wavered for a moment on the button. Then, decisively, he pressed it hard. "Tell him okay," he gasped, his nerves taut as cables. 714 here. We're flying straight and level. Janet's voice sounded miraculously sweet and calm to him.
Well done, George. As soon as you got the feel of it, try some very gentle turns, not more than 2 or 3 degrees. Can you see the turn indicator? It's almost directly in front of your eyes and slightly to the right, just by the panel light shield. Over.
Trelaven's eyes were closed with the effort of visualizing the cockpit layout. He opened them and spoke to the dispatcher.
Listen, I got a lot of work to do with this man in the air, but we ought to start planning the approach and landing while there's still plenty of time. Get the chief radar operator up here, will you, and let me talk to him.
Very gingerly, Spencer extended his left leg and eased the control column over. This time it seemed an age before the aircraft responded to his touch, and he saw the horizon indicator tilt. Gratified, he tried the other way, but now the movement was alarming. He looked down at the ASI and was shocked to see that it had dropped to 180 knots. Quickly, he eased the control column forward, then he breathed again as the speed rose slowly to 210.
Should have asked you this before, came Trelaven's voice. What kind of weather you in up there?
It's clear where we are right now, answered Janet, except below us, of course.
Huh? You better keep me informed. Now, George, we have to press on here. I mean, you may hit some cloud layer at any time with a little turbulence. Now, if you do, I want you to be ready for it. How does she handle?
Spencer looked across to Janet. Tell him sluggish as hell, like a wet sponge, he said between clenched teeth.
Hello, Vancouver, as sluggish as a wet sponge, repeated Janet. That's a natural feeling, George, said Trelaven, because you're used to smaller airplanes. Now, you'll have to expect it to feel even worse when you really throw around up there. You'll soon get used to it.
The dispatcher cut in.
I've got the radar chief here. You'll have to wait, said Trelaven. I'll talk to him as soon as I get a break. Right. Hello, George, called Trelaven. You must avoid any violent movements of the controls, such as you used to make in fighter airplanes. If you do move the controls violently, you'll overcorrect and you'll be in trouble. That understood? Over.
Yes, Vancouver, we understand. Over.
Now, George, I want you to try the effect of fore and aft control on your airspeed. To start with, adjust your throttle settings so as to reduce speed to 160 and cruise straight and level.
Okay, Vancouver, we're doing as you say.
Time ticked away as the speed slowly dropped. At 160, George adjusted the trim tabs and held up his thumb to Janet.
714 here, Vancouver, 160 knots on the indicator. Trelaven waited until he had struggled out of his jacket before speaking.
Right, George. Try a little up and down movement. Over.
He put the microphone down.
Where's the radar chief?
Here.
What range will this aircraft show up on your scope? Queried Trelaven. 60 miles, thereabouts, Captain. Well, that's no good for a while, then. Well, said Trelaven, partly to himself, partly to Burdick. We can't have everything at once. I've had to assume that he's still heading in the general westerly direction. Next call, though, we'll check his heading. Can't he come in on the beam? Asked Burdick. Right now, he's got enough to worry about. If I try to get him in on the beam, he'll have to mess around with the radio, changing frequencies, a lot of other stuff. I'd sooner take a chance, Harry. Let him go a few miles off course. That makes sense, Burdick conceded. Here's how we'll handle it, said the pilot. He turned to the radar chief. I'll do the talking. He's getting used to me now.
Right, sir.
As soon as he shows up on your scope, you can feed me the information. I'll relay it. Can you fix up a closed circuit between me and the radar room? We can take care of that, said the dispatcher. How about the final approach? Asked the radar chief. I will handle it the same way, said Trelaven. Directly we got him on the scope and he's steady on course, we'll move to the tower. You report up there and we'll decide on the runway and plan the approach.
Yes, sir.
Trelaven picked up the microphone. Hello, George Spencer. Everything okay? Over.
All under control, Vancouver, replied Janet.
Good. What's your present heading, George? Spencer peered down.
Tell him the magnetic compass is still showing about 290, and I've been keeping fairly steady on that. She did so.
Okay, very well, George. Try to stay on that heading. You may be a little out, but I'll tell you when to correct. Right now, I want you to feel how the ship handles at lower speeds and when the flaps and wheels are down. But don't do anything till I give you the instructions. Is that clear? Over. Janet got Spencer's nod and asked Trelaven to proceed. Hello, 714. First of all, you throttle back slightly, not much now, and get your airspeed steady at 160 knots.
Adjust your trim to maintain level flight, and then tell me when you're ready. Over. Spencer straightened himself and called over. Watch that airspeed, Janet. He'll have to call it off to me when we land, so you may as well start practicing now. His hand nursed the throttle levers, almost caressing them into the exact positioning to achieve the speed he wanted. Janet's eyes were riveted on the flickering needle of the dial. 150, 150, 155, 160. It's steady on 160. Spencer puffed out his cheeks. That's got it. Tell him, Jan. Hello, Vancouver. Our speed's steady on 160. Over. Okay, 714. Now, George, I want you to put on, 15 degrees of flap, but be careful not to make it any more. Flap lever's at the base of the control pedestal, and it's marked plainly. Spencer located the lever. Confirm that, he told Janet. But you better do it, right? She acknowledged to Vancouver and sat waiting, her hand on the lever. Hello, 714. When I tell you, push it all the way down and watch that dial. When the needle reaches 15 degrees, pull the lever up and leave it at the second notch. We're ready, Vancouver, said Janet. Right. Go ahead, then. Trelaven's voice crackled in the earphones. Your flaps down yet? We're just putting them down, said Janet. Hold it. Well, I omitted to tell you. When the flaps are down, you will lose airspeed, so bring it back to 140. 140, over. At a nod from Spencer, she pushed the lever down as far as it would go, while Spencer watched the indicator carefully. Right, now back to the second notch. With infinite caution, he cajoled the ASI needle until it rested steadily at 140. Tell him, Janet. Hello, Vancouver. Our flaps are down 15 degrees, and the airspeed is 140. Okay, 714. Now, next thing is to put the wheels down. Then you'll get the feeling of the airplane as it'll be when you're landing. Try to keep your altitude steady and your speed at 140. When you're ready, and make sure you are ready, put down the landing gear and let the speed come back to 120. Ask him, said Spencer. What about propeller controls and mixtures? At Janet's question, Trelaven said in an aside to Burdick, Well, this guy's thinking anyway for the time being. He said into the microphone, Leave him alone. Just concentrate on holding that airspeed steady with the wheels and flaps down. Later on, I'll give you a full cockpit check for landing. Over. Tell him understood, said Spencer. We're putting down the wheels now. Look for 3 green lights to show you that they're locked. Also, there's a pressure gauge on the extreme left of the center panel, and the needle should be in the green range. Check. Are they on? Asked Spencer. Janet looked and nodded. You better tell him, then. Yes, Vancouver. All correct. Adjust the throttle to maintain the altitude. Then I'll give you instructions for holding your height and airspeed while you raise the landing gear and the flaps. Follow me exactly, and you got nothing to worry about. You quite clear, George? Tell him yes. We're putting on full flap now. Once more, her hand pushed hard on the flap lever, and the airspeed started to fall. Spencer's voice was tight with the effort of will he was imposing on himself. All right, Janet, let him know. My God, she's a ton weight. Hello, Vancouver. Flaps are full on, and the airspeed is 110. Mr. Spencer says she's heavier than ever. Nice going, George. We'll make an airline pilot out of you yet. Now, we'll get you back to where you were, and then run through the procedure again with certain variations regarding props, mixtures, boosters, and so on, okay? Over. Again? Spencer groaned. I don't know if I can take it. All right, Janet. Okay, Vancouver, we're ready. Right, 714. Using the reverse procedure, adjust your flaps to read 15 degrees and speed 120 knots. Now you'll have to throttle back slightly to keep that speed. Go ahead. Reaching down, Janet grasped the flap lever and gave it a tug. It failed to move. She bent closer and tried again. What is it? Asked Spencer. Sort of stiff. I can't get it to move this time. Shouldn't be. Give it a good steady pull. It must be me. I just can't seem to make it budge. Here, let me. He took his hand off the column and pulled the lever back effortlessly. Look out, she screamed. The airspeed. It was 90, moving to 75. Bracing himself against the sudden acute angle of the flight deck, Spencer knew they were in a bad stall, an incipient spin. Keep your head, he ordered himself savagely. Think, if she spins, we're finished. Which way's the stall? Okay, it's to the left. Try to remember what they taught you at flying school. Stick forward, hard opposite rudder. Stick forward. Keep it forward. We're gaining speed. Opposite rudder now. Watch the instruments. They can't be right. I can feel us turning. No. Trust him. He must trust him. Be ready to straighten. That's it. Come on, lady. Come on.
"The mountains!" exclaimed Janet. "I can see the ground." Ease back. Not too fast. Hold the airspeed steady. We're coming out. It worked. We're coming out. 105, 110, 115, Janet read off in a strangled tone. "It's completely black now. We must be in a fog or something. Get the wheels up. The mountains. We must get the wheels up," I said. Like a man in a nightmare, possessed with a fury of desperation, his teeth clenched and his face streaked with sweat, Spencer fought to regain control of the aircraft, one hand on the throttle level and the other gripped tightly on the wheel. Within him, oddly at variance with a strong sense of unreality, he felt scorching anger and self-disgust. Somewhere along the line, and quickly, he'd not only lost altitude, but practically all his airspeed, too. He felt a violent, almost uncontrollable desire to scream like a child. "We're gaining height," came Janet's voice, incredibly level now, it seemed. He remembered her with a shock, and in that moment the screaming in his mind became the screams of a woman in the passenger compartment behind him. Wild, maniacal screams. He heard a man shouting, "He's not the pilot, I tell you! They're stretched out there, both of them! We're done for!" "Shut up and sit down," rasped Baird clearly. "You can't order me about—" "I said get back and sit down." "All right, Doctor," came the adenoidal tones of Otpot, the man from Lancashire. "Just leave him to me." Baird's voice called from the doorway above the rising thunder of the engine. "What's going on anyway in there? You're all right," Spencer answered. "Sorry, Doc, I just couldn't hold her. I think it's okay now." "I'll try to keep level at least," Baird complained. "There are people back here very, very ill." "It was my fault," said Janet. She saw Baird sway with exhaustion and hold onto the door jamb to steady himself. No, protested Spencer. "If it hadn't been for her, we'd have crashed. I just can't handle this thing. That's all there is to it." "Rubbish," said Baird curtly. They heard a man shout, "Get on the radio!" and the doctor's voice raised loudly to address the passengers. "Now listen to me, all of you. Panic's the most infectious disease of the lot, and the most lethal, too." Then the door slammed shut, cutting him off. "That's better," said Janet calmly. "Oh, I ought to be reporting to Captain Trelawny." "Yes," agreed Spencer. "Tell him what's happening and that I'm regaining height." Janet pressed her microphone button to transmit and called Vancouver. For the first time, there was no immediate acknowledgement in reply. She called again. There was nothing. "Let me," said Spencer. He took his right hand from the throttle and depressed his microphone button. Hello, Vancouver. This is Spencer, 714. Emergency. Come in, please." The silence seemed as solid and as tangible as a wall. It was as if they were the only people in the world. "I'm getting a reading on the transmitting dial," said Spencer. "I'm sure we're sending okay." He tried again with no result. "Calling all stations. Mayday. This is Flight 714 in serious trouble. Come in, anybody. Over." The ether seemed completely dead. "Well, that settles it. We must be off frequency." "But how could that have happened?" "Now, don't ask me. Anything can happen the way we were just now. You'll have to go around the dial, Janet." Janet slid out of her seat, trailing the cord from her headset behind her, and reached up to the radio panel. She clicked the channel selector around slowly. There was a succession of crackles and splutters. "I've been right the way round," she said. "Keep at it," said Spencer. There was a sudden faraway voice. Wait, what's that?" Janet clicked back hurriedly. "Give it more volume." "To 128.3, said the voice with startling nearness. "Vancouver control to Flight 714. Change to frequency 128.3. Reply, please. Over." Janet climbed back into her seat and called rapidly. "Hello, Vancouver. 714 answering. Receiving you loud and clear. Over." The voice of the dispatcher came back. 714, this is Vancouver. We lost you. What happened? Over." "Oh, Vancouver, we glad to hear you," said Janet, holding her forehead. "We had some trouble. The airplane stalled and the radio went off, but it's all right now." This time it was Trelawny speaking again, in the same confident and measured manner as before, but clearly with immense thankfulness. "Hello, Janet. I'm glad you had the good sense to realize you were off frequency. George, I warned you about the danger of a stall. You got to watch your airspeed all the time. There's one thing. If you stalled and recovered, you obviously haven't lost your touch as a pilot. You probably had a bit of a scare, so we'll take it easy for a minute or two. While you're getting some height under you, I want you to give me some readings from the instrument panel. We'll start with the fuel tank gauges." The door to the passenger deck opened and Baird looked in. He took in their concentration on the instrument panel and, after checking on the pilots, without a word let himself out, carefully sliding the door closed. The scene outside resembled a vast casualty ambulance rather than the passenger deck of an airliner. At intervals along the crowded cabin, their reclining seats fully extended, sick passengers lay swaddled in rugs. One or two were quite motionless, scarcely breathing.
Others were twisting in pain, while friends or relatives watched them fearfully or replaced damp cloths on their foreheads. Bending forward, the more effectively to render his homily to the man he had recently thrust back into his seat, Otpot was saying, "I don't blame you, see. Happen it's better sometimes to let off steam. But it don't do to start shouting in front of the others who poorly, especially the ladies." Baird squatted down to look at Mrs. Childer, feeling inside her blanket for her wrist and noting her pinched, immobile face, dry skin, and quick, shallow breathing. Her husband demanded hoarsely, "Doctor, is there nothing we can do for her?" Baird looked at the closed, sunken eyes of the woman. He said slowly, "Mr. Childer, you are right to know the truth. You're a sensible man, I'll give it to you straight. We're making all the speed we possibly can, but at best it'll be touch and go for your wife." Childer's mouth moved wordlessly. "You'd better understand this," Baird went on deliberately. "I've done what I could for her. I'll continue to do it, but it's pathetically little. Early on, using morphine, I might have been able to ease the pain for your wife. Now, if it's any consolation to you, nature has taken care of it for us." At that moment, in the control room at Vancouver, Trelawny now had on a headset and microphone, and into the latter he was asking, "Radar, you getting anything at all?" From another part of the building, the chief radar operator, seated with an assistant before a long-range azimuth scanner, answered in a calmly conversational tone, "Not a thing yet." "Can't understand it," Trelawny said to the controller. "They ought to be in range by now," Burdick volunteered. "Well, don't forget he lost speed in that last practice." "Yeah, that's so," Trelawny agreed. He nodded to the radio operator. "Put me on the air. Hello, 714. Now listen carefully, George. We're going through that drill again. Before we start, I want to explain a few things you may have forgotten or that only apply to big airplanes. You with me? Over." Janet replied, "Go ahead, Vancouver. We're listening carefully. Over." "Right, 714. Now, before you can land, certain checks and adjustments got to be carried out. They're in addition to the landing drill you just practiced. I'll tell you when and how to do them later. Now I just want to run over them to prepare you." Janet and Spencer did as they were directed. "Hello, Vancouver. We're okay on that." 714. "Check again that you're in level flight. Over." "Hello, Vancouver. Yes, flying level now and above cloud." "Right, 714. Now, George, let's have 15 degrees of flap again, speed 140, and we'll go through the wheel lowering routine. Watch that airspeed like a hawk this time. If you're ready, let's go." In the control room, Trelawny took an opportunity to gulp some cold coffee. He accepted a cigarette from Burdick and exhaled the smoke noisily. "How do you read the situation now?" queried the airline manager. "That's as well as can be expected," said the captain. "But time's running dangerously short. He should have at least a dozen runs through this flap and wheels drill alone. And with luck, we'll get about 3 in before he's overhead, that is, if he's on course." "You're going to give him practice approaches," put in the controller. "I've got to. Without at least 2 or 3, I wouldn't give a red cent for his chances, not with the experience he's got." He spoke into his headset. "Radar, you getting anything?" "Still nothing," came the even, impersonal reply. "Hold it, though. Wait a minute. This may be something coming up. Yes, Captain, I have him now. He is 10 miles south of track. Have him turn right on to a heading of 265. "Nice work," said Trelawny. He nodded to be put on the air as the switchboard operator called across. "Air Force report visual contact, sir. ETA 38 minutes. "Right." He raised the microphone in front of him. "Hello, 714. You carried out the reverse procedure for flap and undercart? Over." "Yes, Vancouver, over," came the girl's voice. "Any trouble this time? You flying straight and level?" "Everything's all right, Vancouver. The pilot says so far." They heard her give a nervous little laugh. "That's fine, 714. We have you on radar now. You're off course, 10 miles to the south. I want you to bank carefully to the right, using your throttles to maintain your present speed, and place the aircraft on a heading of 265. I'll repeat that. 265. Is that clear? Over." "Understood, Vancouver." Trelawny slumped into a chair, his head bowed with a hand over his eyes. But at the first splutter as the amplifier came alive, he was on his feet, reaching for the microphone. "Hello, Vancouver," called Janet. "We're now on a heading of 265 as instructed. Over." 714, that's fine," said Trelawny with an assumed cheerfulness. "You're doing splendidly.
Let's have it all again, shall we? This'll be the last time before you reach the airport, George, so make it good.
The controller was speaking with quiet urgency into his telephone. Yes, they'll be with us in half an hour.
Let's get the show on the road.
Spencer tried to ease his aching legs. His whole body felt pummeled and bruised. In his anxiety and the effort of concentration, he'd expended almost unnecessary energy, leaving him the moment he relaxed, utterly drained of strength. "Have you noticed the sun's coming up?" said Janet. "Yeah, why, sure," he lied, shifting his eyes. "Janet?" "Yes?" "Before we go down, have another look at the pilots. We'll probably bump a bit, and we don't want them thrown about." "Can you hold on there for a moment?" she asked.
"Don't worry, I'll yell quick enough."
She slipped off her headset and rose from her seat. As she turned to get out, the door to the passenger deck opened and Baird looked in.
"Oh, you're off the radio," he observed.
"I was just going to have a look at the captain and co-pilot to make sure they're secure."
No need to, he told her. "Did it a few minutes ago when you were busy."
"Doctor," called Spencer, "how are things with you back there?"
"That's why I looked in," said Baird tensely. "We're running out of time, but fast. How long is it likely to be now?"
"Less than half an hour, I'd say. How does that sound?"
"I don't know,"
Baird said doubtfully. Spencer grimaced. "Is anyone giving you a hand?"
"You bet. Couldn't possibly manage otherwise. One fellow in particular, the English character, he really turned out a..."
The earphones came to life.
"Hello, 714. This is Vancouver. Over."
Spencer waved Janet back into her seat, and she hurriedly donned her headset.
"Well, I'll get back," said Baird. "Good luck anyway."
"Go ahead, Vancouver. I hear you," she called.
"Janet, when we make this landing, we want you to follow the emergency crash procedures for protection of the passengers. You understand? Over."
"I understand, Captain. Over."
One more thing, Janet. Just before the landing, we'll ask the pilot to sound the emergency bell. And George, switch for that bell is right over the co-pilot seat, and it's painted red.
"Can you see it?" asked Spencer without looking up.
"Yes," said Janet. "It's here."
"Now, George," Trelawny went on, "as you approach the airport, I'll give you a cockpit check of the really essential things. I want you to familiarize yourself with them as we go along." In the control room at Vancouver, Trelawny took a dead cigarette from his mouth and tossed it away. He looked up at the electric wall clock and back at the controller. "How much gas they got?" he demanded. Grimsel, the controller, picked up the clipboard from the table. "In flying time, enough for about 90 minutes, he said. "Well, what's the angle, Captain?" asked Burdick. "Yeah, you figure there's plenty of time for circuits and approaches, don't you?" "There's got to be," said Trelawny. "This is a first-flight solo. Keep a strict check on it, will you, Mr. Grimsel? We must have plenty in hand for a long run out over the ocean if I decide as last measure to ditch."
He stood by the radio panel, his fingers drumming absently, his eyes fixed on the clock. Outside the airport, in the first light of dawn, the emergency measures were in full swing.
"Hello, Vancouver," called Janet a little breathlessly. I've given the necessary instructions. Over."
"Good girl," said Trelawny with relief.
"Now, George," he went on quickly, "the clock is running a little against us. First, reset your altimeter to 30.1, then throttle back slightly, but hold your airspeed steady until you loosen height at 500 feet per minute. Watch your instruments closely. You'll have a long descent through cloud."
Spencer spread his fingers round the throttles and gently moved them back. The climb and descent indicator fell slowly and a little unevenly to 600, then rose again to remain fairly steady at 500.
"Tell him we're holding steady at 500 feet a minute," instructed Spencer, and Janet did so. "Right, 714. Now, George, this is a little more tricky. Don't break your concentration. This is what you'll do as you come in. First, switch the hydraulic booster pump on. Now, remember, you got to fix these things in your mind. Don't do anything now. The gauge is on the extreme left of the panel, under and to the left of the gyro control. Got it? Over." He heard Janet's voice reply.
"Pilot knows that one, Vancouver, and has located the switch."
"Right, 714. Surprised now it comes back, isn't it, George?" Trelawny pulled out a handkerchief and wiped the back of his neck. "Next, you'll have to turn off the de-icer control. Now, that's bound to be on, and it'll show on the gauge on the right of the panel, just in front of Janet. Next item, brake pressure. Now, there are two gauges, one for the inboard brake and one for the outboard. They're immediately to the right of the hydraulic boost, which you just found. Over."
After a pause, Janet confirmed.
"Found them, Vancouver."
"Now, the gills. They must be 1/3 closed.
The switch is right by Janet's left knee, and you'll see it's marked in thirds. You with me? Over.
Yes, I see it, Vancouver. Over.
You can work that one, Janet. Next to it on the same bank of switches are the port and starboard intercooler switches. Now, they're clearly marked. They'll have to be opened fully. Make sure of that, Janet, won't you? Open fully. The next and most important thing is the landing gear. You've been through the drill, but go over it thoroughly in your mind first, starting with a flat movement and ending with the wheels fully down and locked. Now, is this understood by both of you?
Tell him yes, thanks, said Spencer, his eyes not leaving the panel.
Okay, 714. When you're on the approach and after the wheels are down, the fuel booster pumps must be turned on. Otherwise, your supply of gas might be cut off at the worst moment. The switch for these is at 5 o'clock from the autopilot, just behind the mixture controls. Now, the mixture is to be changed to auto-rich. I know George has been itching for that, so I won't say any more. He'll handle that all right. Then you have to set the propellers until the green lights under the switches come on. Now, they're just about touching George's right knee, I think. Got it?
Pilot says yes, Vancouver.
Lastly now, the superchargers. After the wheels are down, these must be set in the takeoff position. That is, up on your aircraft. They're the 4 levers to the left of the throttles. Well, now, any questions about all that? Over.
Ask him about the time, said Spencer. How much have we got? Janet put the question to Vancouver.
Well, like I said, George, you got all the time in the world, but we just don't want to waste any. You'll be over the airport in about 12 minutes. Now, don't let that bother you. There'll be as much time as you like for further practice.
A pause.
Radar reports a course adjustment necessary, George. Change your heading 5 degrees to 260, please. Over.
Trelawny switched off his microphone and spoke to the controller.
They're well on the glide path now, he said. As soon as we got visual contact, I'll level them off and take them around for circuits and drills. We'll see how they shape up after that. Everything's set here, said the controller. He called to his assistant. Put the entire field on alert.
Hello, Vancouver, came Janet's voice over the amplifier.
We've now changed course to 260, over. Okay, 714.
Trelawny hitched up his trousers with one hand.
Let's have a check on your height, please. Over.
Vancouver, answered Janet after a few seconds. Our height is 2,500 feet.
On his headset, Trelawny heard the radar operator report. 15 miles from the field. That's fine, George, he said. You'll be coming out of cloud any minute. Soon as you do, look for the airport beacon. Over.
A long pause followed. Suddenly the radio crackled into life, catching Janet in mid-sentence. She was saying excitedly, "Lifting very slightly. I thought I saw something. I'm not sure. Yes, there it is. I see it. Do you see it, Mr. Spencer? Right ahead. We can see the beacon, Vancouver."
"They've broken through," Trelawny shouted. "All right, George," he called into the microphone. "Level off now at 2,000 feet and wait for instructions. I'm moving to the control tower now, so you won't hear from me for a few minutes. We'll decide on the runway to use at the last minute so you can land into the wind. Now, before that, you make some dummy runs to practice your landing approaches. Over."
They heard Spencer's voice say, "I'll take this, Janet."
"No dice, Vancouver. Situation doesn't allow. We're coming straight in."
"What?" shouted Burdick. "He can't." "Don't be a fool, George," said Trelawny urgently. "You gotta have some practice runs."
"I'm holding my line of descent," Spencer intoned deliberately, his voice shaking slightly. "There are people up here dying. Dying! Can you get that into your heads? Now, I'll stand as much chance on the first run-in as I will on the 10th. I'm coming straight in."
"Let me talk to him," appealed the controller.
"No," said Trelawny. "There's no time for argument." His face was white, a vein in his temple pulsed. "We got to act fast. I say we got no choice. By all the rules, he's in command of that airplane. I'm going to accept his decision."
"You can't do that," Burdick protested. "Don't you realize—"
"All right, George," Trelawny called. "If that's the way you want it. Stand by and level off. We're going to the tower now." The 3 men leaped out of the room and raced along the corridor, Burdick bringing up the rear. Ignoring the elevator, they bounded up the stairs, almost knocking over a janitor coming down, burst into the tower control room. An operator stood at the massive sweep of windows, studying the lightening sky through night binoculars. "There he is," he announced. Trelawny snatched up a second pair of glasses, took a quick look, then put him down. "All right," he said, panting. "Let's make our decision on the runway."
08, said the operator. "It's the longest, and it's pretty well into the wind."
Trelawny took a headset that was handed to him and put it on.
"Is this hooked up to the radar room?" he asked.
"Yes, sir, right here."
Leaning down on the top of a control console, the captain flicked the switch of a desk microphone. At his elbow, the spools of a tape recorder began to revolve.
"Hello, George Spencer," he called in a steady, even tone. "This is Paul Trelawny in Vancouver Tower. Do you read me? Over."
Janet's voice filled the control room. "Yes, Captain, you're loud and clear. Over." Over the telephone, the calm voice of the radar operator reported,
10 miles, turn to a heading of 253. "All right, George." You're now 10 miles from the airport. Turn to a heading at 253. Throttle back and begin to lose height to 1,000 feet. Janet, put the preliminary landing procedure in hand for the passengers. She unhooked a microphone from the cabin wall and pressed the stud, speaking into it. Attention, please, everyone. Attention, please. Will you please resume your seats and fasten your safety belts? We shall be landing in a few minutes. Thank you. Well done, Spencer complimented her. Just like any old landing, eh? She tried to smile back, biting her lower lip. Well, not quite that, she said. You got plenty of what it takes, said Spencer soberly. I'd like you to know I couldn't have held on this far without... He broke off, gently moving the rudder and the ailerons, waiting to feel the response from the aircraft. Janet, he said, his eye on the instruments. We haven't much more time. This is what we knew must happen sooner or later, but I want to make sure you understand why I must try to get her down somehow on the first shot. Yes, she said quietly, I understand. She'd clipped her safety belt around her waist, and now her hands were clenched together tightly in her lap. Well, I want to say thanks, he went on stumblingly. I made no promises right from the start, and I make none now. I mean, you know, if anyone does, just how lousy I am at this, but taking turns around the field won't help, and some of the folk in the back are getting worse every minute. It's better for them to take their chance quickly. I told you, she said. You don't have to explain. He heard himself say, Here we go, then. This is it, Janet. I'm starting to lose height now. Harry Burdick lowered his binoculars and handed them back to the tower controller. Without a word, they left the observation gallery and re-entered the great glass surround of the control tower. Trelawin and Grimsel were crouched before the desk microphone, their features bathed in the glow from the runway light indicators set into the control console in front of them. Wind still okay? Asked the captain. Grimsel nodded. Slightly across runway 08, but that's still our best bet. 08 was the longest of the airport's 3 runways, as Trelawin well knew. Radar, said Trelawin into his headset. Keep me fed the whole time. Whether or not you can hear that I'm on the air, this won't be a normal talk-down. What if he comes in badly, put in Grimsel. What's your plan? Well, he probably will, let's face it, Trelawin retorted grimly. If it's hopeless, I'll try to bring him round again. Won't save any further arguments on the air unless it's obvious he doesn't stand a chance. Then I'll try to insist he puts down in the ocean. He listened for a moment to the calm recital of radar readings in his earphones, then pressed the switch of the microphone. George, let your airspeed come back to 160 knots and hold it steady there. The amplifier came alive as 714 took the air. There was an agonizing pause before Janet's voice intoned, We're still losing height, over. Good, said Trelawin. Now set your mixture controls to takeoff, that is, up to the top position. He fixed his eyes on his wristwatch, counting the sweep of the second hand. Take your time, George. When you're ready, turn your carburetor heat controls to cold. They're just forward there, the throttles. In the aircraft, Spencer peered apprehensively from one control to the next. His face was a rigid mask. He heard Trelawin's voice resume its inexorable monologue. The next thing, George, is to set the air filter to ram and the superchargers to low. Take your time now. Spencer looked about him wildly. The air filter controls the single lever below the mixture controls. Now move it into the up position. Can you see it, Janet? Asked Spencer anxiously. Yes, I have it, she added quickly. Look, the airport's right below us. You can see the long main runway. Plenty long, I hope, Spencer gritted, not lifting his head. The supercharger controls, continued Trelawin, are 4 levers to the right of the mixture controls. Move them to the up position also. Got 'em, said Spencer. Yes. Now, let's have that 15 degrees of flap, Trelawin instructed. 15 degrees down to the second notch. The indicator dial's in the center of the main panel. When you have 15 degrees on, bring your airspeed back slowly up to 140 knots and adjust your trim for level flight. As soon as you've done that, switch the hydraulic booster pump on extreme left by the gyro control. Through Trelawin's headset, the radar operator interposed. Turn to 225. I'm getting a height reading, Captain. He's all over the place, 900 up to 1,300 feet. Change course to 225, said Trelawin, and watch your height. It's too irregular. Try to keep steady at 1,000 feet. He's dropping off fast, said the operator. 1,000, 1,000, 900, 800, 700. Watch your height, Trelawin warned. Use more throttle and keep that nose up. 650, 600, 550. Get back that height, barked Trelawin. Get it back. You need 1,000 feet. 550, 450, called off the operator, calm but sweating. This isn't good, Captain. 400, 400, 450, 450. He's going up. 500.
For a moment, Trelhaven cracked. He tore off his headset and swung round to Burdick. "He can't fly it," he shouted. "Of course he can't fly it." "Keep talking to him," Burdick spat out, lunging forward at the captain and seizing his arm. "Keep talking, for Christ's sake. Tell him what to do." Trelhaven grabbed at the microphone, bringing it to his mouth. "Spencer," he said urgently, "you can't come straight in. Listen to me. You got to do some circuits and practice that approach. There's enough fuel left for 2 hours flying. Stay up, man, stay up." They listened intently as Spencer's voice came through. "You better get this down there. I'm coming in, do you hear me? I'm coming in. There are people up here who'll die in less than an hour, never mind 2. I may bend the airplane a bit, but that's a chance we'll have to take. Now get on with a landing check. I'm putting the gear down now." And they heard him say, "Wheels down, Janet." "All right, George, all right," said Trelhaven heavily. He slipped the headset on again. He'd recovered his composure, but a muscle in his jaw worked convulsively. "Your undercarriage is down. Check for the 3 green lights, remember? Keep your heading steady at 225. Increase your throttle setting slightly to hold your airspeed now. The wheels are down. Adjust your trim and keep all the height you can, right? Check that brake pressure. It should be showing around 1,000 pounds. The gauge is to the right of the hydraulic booster on the panel. If the pressure's okay, don't answer. You with me? Then open the gills to 1/3. As Trelhaven went on, his voice filling the hushed control tower, Burdick moved to the plate glass window, searching the sky low on the horizon. The captain's precise monotone formed a somber background to the thoughts of the frantically worried airline manager. "Now advance your propeller settings," Trelhaven was saying, "so that the tachometers give a reading of 2250 RPM on each engine. Don't acknowledge that." 2250, Spencer repeated to himself, watching the dials closely as he made the adjustment. "Janet," he said, "let me hear the airspeed." "It's 130, she began tonelessly. 125, 120, 125, 130. "George," said Trelhaven, "let your airspeed come back to 120 knots and adjust your trim. Now repeat that. Airspeed 120. He looked down at his watch. "Take it nice and easy now." "Still losing height," reported the radar operator. 800 feet, 750, 700. "You're losing height," rapped out Trelhaven. "You're losing height. Open up. Open it up. You must keep it at around 1,000. Janet continued her reading of the airspeed. 110, 110, 105, 110, 110, 120, 120, 120. It's steady at 120. Come up, gritted Spencer between his teeth, hauling on the control column. "What a lumbering great wagon this is. Doesn't respond. It doesn't respond at all. 125, 130, 130, steady on 130. Height coming up to 900 feet, intoned the radar operator. 950 on 1,000 now. Maintain 1,000. Trelhaven called to the tower controller. "He's turning on to final. Put out your runway lights except 08. He spoke into the microphone. "Straighten out on a heading between 074 and 080. Watch your airspeed and your height. Keep it at 1,000 feet until I tell you. Now come out of your turn, George, when you're ready, and line up with the runway. You'll see directly ahead of you. It's raining, so you want your windshield wipers. The switch is down at the right on the co-pilot side, and it's clearly marked." "Find it, Janet," said Spencer. "Hold your height at 1,000 feet, George. We've taken you a long way out, so you got lots of time. Have Janet look for the landing light switch. It's on the panel overhead, little left to center. Hold your height steady." "Can you find the switch?" asked Spencer. "Just a minute. Yes, I've got it." "Correct your course," said Trelhaven. "Line yourself up straight and true. Hold that height, George. Now listen carefully. Aim to touch down about 1/3 of the way along the runway. There's a slight crosswind from the left, so be ready with a gentle right rudder." Spencer brought the nose around slowly. "If you land too fast, use the emergency brakes. You can work them by pulling the red handle immediately in front of you. Now, if that doesn't stop you, cut the 4 ignition switches which are over your head." "You see those switches, Janet?" "Yes." "If I want them off, it'll be in a hurry," said Spencer. "So if I shout, don't lose any time about it." His throat was parched. It felt full of grit. "All right," Janet replied in a whisper. She clasped her hands together to stop them shaking. "It won't be long now, anyway. What about the emergency bell?" "Oh, I hadn't forgotten. I'll ring it just before touchdown. You watch that airspeed. Call it off. 120, 115, 120. "Begin descent," said the radar operator. 400 feet a minute. Check landing gear and flaps. Hold present heading." "All right, George," said Trelhaven. "Put down full flap, bring your airspeed back to 115, adjust your trim, and start losing height at 400 feet a minute. I'll repeat that. Full flap, airspeed 115, let down at 400 feet a minute. Hold your present heading." He turned to Grimsel. "Is everything ready on the field?" The controller nodded. "Ready as it'll ever be. And this is it. In 60 seconds, we'll know." "Janet, give me full flap," ordered Spencer. She thrust the lever down all the way. "Height and airspeed, call 'em off." 1,000 feet, speed 130. 800 feet, speed 120.
700 feet, speed 105. We're going down too quickly.
Get back that height, Trelawin shouted. Get back. You're losing height too fast. I know, Spencer shouted back. He pushed the throttles forward. Keep watching it, he told the girl.
650 feet, speed 100, 400 feet, speed 100.
Eyes smarting with sweat and his almost feverish concentration, he juggled to correlate speed with an even path of descent, conscious with a deep, sickening terror of the relentless approach of the runway, nearer with every second. The aircraft swayed from side to side, engines alternately revving and falling. Burdick yelled from the tower balcony, "Look at him, he's got no control!" Keeping his glasses leveled at the oncoming aircraft, Trelawin snapped into the microphone. Open up, you're losing height too fast. Watch the airspeed, for God's sakes. Your nose is too high. Open up quickly or she'll stall. Come on, open up, I tell you, open up!
He's heard you, said Grimsel. He's recovering.
Me too, I wish, said Burdick. The radar operator announced, still 100 feet below glide path, 50 feet below glide path. Get up, urged Trelawin. If you haven't rung the alarm bell yet, do it now. Seats upright, passengers head down. As the shrill warning rang out in the aircraft, Baird roared at the top of his voice, "Everybody down! Hold as tight as you can!" In the tower, Grimsel spoke into a telephone-type microphone.
All firefighting and salvage equipment stand fast until the aircraft has passed him. She may swing.
His voice echoed back metallically from the buildings.
He's back to 200 feet, reported radar. Still below glide path, 150 feet. Still below glide path. He's too low, Captain. 100 feet.
Trelawin dragged off the headset. He jumped to his feet, holding the microphone in one hand and the binoculars in the other. "Maintain that height," he instructed, "until you get closer into the runway. Be ready to ease off gently. Just let her down. That looks about right. Now you watch the airspeed. Your nose is creeping up." There was a momentary sound of other voices in the background. "Straighten up just before you touch down. Be ready to meet the drift with a right rudder. All right, now you get ready to round out." The end of the gray runway, 200 feet across, slid under them. "Now," said Trelawin, "you're coming in too fast. Lift the nose up. Get it up. Come on, boy. Back up the throttles. Right back. Hold her up. Not too much. Not too much. Be ready for that crosswind. Ease her down. Ease her down. Now, hey." Undercarriage within a few feet of the runway surface, Spencer moved the control column gently back and forth, trying to feel his way down to the ground. His throat constricted with panic because he now realized how much higher was this cockpit than any other plane he'd ever flown in, making judgment almost impossible for him. For what seemed an age, the wheels skimmed the runway, making no contact. Then with a jolt, they touched down. There was a shriek of rubber and a puff of smoke, and the shock bounced the aircraft right into the air again. Then the big tires were once more fighting to find a purchase on the concrete. A third bump followed, then another, and yet another. Cursing through his clenched teeth, Spencer hauled the control column back into his stomach, all the nightmare fears of the past few hours now a paralyzing reality. The gray stream below him jumped up, receded, jumped up again. Then, miraculously, it remained still. They were down. He eased on the toe brakes and then held them hard, using all the strength in his legs. "You're landing too fast," roared Trelawin. "Use the emergency brakes. Pull the red handle." Spencer tugged desperately on the handle. He hauled the control column back into his stomach, jammed his feet on the brakes. He felt the tearing strain in his arms as the aircraft tried to slew. The wheels locked, skidded, then ran free again. "Cut the switches," he shouted. With a sweep of her hand, Janet snapped them off. The din of the engines died away, leaving in the cabin the hum of gyros and radio equipment, and outside the screaming of tires. Spencer stared ahead in fascinated horror. With no sound of engines, the aircraft was still traveling fast, the ground leaping past them in a blur. He could see now a big checkerboard marking the turn at the far end of the runway. In the fraction of a second, his eyes registered the picture of a fire truck, its driver falling to the ground in his scramble to get away. Trelawin's voice burst into his ears with the force of a blow. "Ground loop it to the left! Ground loop it to the left! Hard left rudder!" Making an instantaneous decision, Spencer put his left foot on the rudder pedal and threw all his weight behind it, pressing it forward savagely. Veering suddenly from the runway, the aircraft began to swing in an arc. Flung over to the right side of his seat, Spencer struggled to keep the wings clear of the ground. There was a rending volume of noise, a dazzling flash as the undercarriage ripped away and the aircraft smashed to the ground on its belly. The impact lifted Spencer clean from his seat. He felt a sharp pain as his safety belt bit deeply into his flesh. "Get your head down!" he yelled. "We're piling up!" Like a prisoner in some crazy, helpless juggernaut, blood appearing in the corner of his mouth from a chance blow as yet unfelt, he waited for the inevitable tip-over, the upending, splintering crash that would, for him, disintegrate into 1,000 fiery pinpoints of light before they were swallowed into darkness. Then, quite suddenly, they were moving no longer. Spencer seemed to feel the same crazy motions as if they were still careening across the field. But his eyes told him that they had stopped. In the passenger compartment behind him there were murmurs and rustlings as of people who, unbelievably awake to find themselves still alive.
Someone laughed shortly and hysterically, and this seemed to let loose half a dozen voices speaking at once. He heard Baird call out, "Is anyone hurt?" The noises melted into confusion. Spencer closed his eyes. He felt himself shaking. "Better open up the emergency doors," came the adenoidal tones of Otpot. "And then everyone stay where he is." From the door to the flight deck, jammed open in the crash, he heard the doctor exclaim, "Wonderful job, Spencer! You both all right?" "I ground-looped," he muttered to himself in disgust. "We turned right around the way we came. What a performance to ground-loop." "Rubbish. It did magnificently," Baird retorted. "As far as I can tell, they're only bruises and a bit of shock back there. Let's have a look at the captain and first officer. They must have been thrown about some." Spencer turned to him. It was painful to move his neck. "Doctor," his throat was hoarse, "are we in time?" "Yes, lad. Just about, I'd say. It's up to the hospital now, anyway. You've done your part." He tried to raise himself in his seat, and at that moment he became aware of the sound of crackling. He felt an upsurge of alarm, and then he realized that the noise was issuing from his headset, which had slipped to the deck. He reached down and picked it up, holding one phone to his ear. "George Spencer," Trelawny was calling. "George Spencer, you there?" Outside there was now a rising crescendo of sirens from crash tenders and fire trucks and ambulances. Spencer heard voices in the passenger compartment behind him. "Yes," he said. "I'm here." Trelawny was jubilant, caught in the general reaction. Behind his voice there were sounds of excited conversation and laughter. "George, boy, that was probably the lousiest landing in the history of this airport, so don't ever ask us for a job as a pilot, but there's some of us here who'd like to shake your hand, and later we'll buy you a drink. Now hold everything, George. We're coming over." Janet had raised her head and was smiling tremulously. "You should see her face," she said. "It's black." And he couldn't think of a thing to say. No witticism, no adequate word of thanks. He knew only that he was intolerably tired and sick to the stomach. He reached over for her hand and grinned back.